Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 476. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about in today's show. New updates on the U.S. plan to send a UN force into Haiti. Bob Menendez is in quite a bit of legal trouble. And updates on the war in Ukraine. So, share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com. YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And then follow me on social media. On Twitter, that's Kyle Anzalone _. On Instagram, that's Kyle Anzalone3. And then I'm just Kyle Anzalone on Facebook. All right, we're going to start off today with some good news. Senator Menendez indicted on corruption scheme benefiting Egyptian government. So, Senator Robert Menendez, his wife, and 3 businessmen have all been indicted by a federal grand jury in a corruption scheme. The New Jersey Democrat, his spouse, Nadine Menendez, allegedly received hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for enriching and protecting the 3 men and supporting the Egyptian government. The scandal has caused Menendez to step down as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Menendez is one of the biggest hawks in the Senate. He, even will go against the president, attempting to say, return to the Obama-era nuclear deal. Huge Iran hawk, huge sanctions hawk, loves to use sanctions for everything. And so when I said this is some good news, getting Bob Menendez as far away from power, it's unlikely that you're going to end up replacing him with somebody worse. All right, so the Department of Justice announced the indictment on Friday. Menendez is among the most powerful men in the upper house of Congress as he chairs the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or did, prior to all this. The indictment reads, from at least 2018 and up to and including or about 2022, Menendez and his wife engaged in a corrupt relationship with 3 New Jersey associates and businessmen, Will Hanna, Jose Uribe, and Fred Diabas. It continues, the indictment continues, Menendez and Nadine Menendez agreed to and did accept hundreds of thousands of dollars of bribes in exchange for using Menendez's power and influence as a senator to seek to enrich and protect Hanna, Uribe, and Diabas, and to benefit the Arab Republic of Egypt. Those bribes included cash, gold, and payments towards a home mortgage, compensation for a low or no-show job, a luxury vehicle, and other things of value. The Department of Justice believes it located over $500,000 in bribe money and other assets. And so there I'm talking specifically just about the gold bars and the cash. I think there's an estimated $480,000 in the house and another $70,000 they found in Menendez's wife's safety deposit box. Now, assuming that there's also cars, mortgage payments, compensation for his wife's low to no show job. So that basically means that, they're going to hire her as a secretary, or I don't know, maybe something higher, a sales associate or whatever. And they're going to just, pay her even though she doesn't show up or do anything. So, this is just kind of a typical way to have a corrupt relationship with somebody, to funnel money into a family, but it kind of appear legal. And so there's that. And then there's also the cars and other things of value, which, I don't know, maybe vacations, dresses, clothes, jewelry, stuff like that. So Menendez previously faced corruption charges in 2017 and was not convicted due to a hung jury. The senator and his wife had denied the charges in the DOJ indictment. The co-defendants have also denied involvement. Hanna is an Egyptian American who owns ISEG Halal Certified Inc., according to the company's LinkedIn page, is the only entity exclusively authorized by the government of Egypt to certify halal exports worldwide. Hanna is a business associate of Uribe and Diabas. Diabas is a New Jersey developer who pled guilty to banking crimes last year and is scheduled to be sentenced in October. The real estate businessman has been able to delay his sentencing 4 times. During that period, he inked a $45 million development agreement with the Qatari government. Regarding the scheme to aid Cairo, the indictment explains Menendez promised to promised to and did use his influence and power and breach his office duty in a way that benefited the government of Egypt and Will Hanna. Among others, among other actions, Menendez provided sensitive U.S. government information and took other steps that secretly aided the Egyptian government. Menendez improperly advised and pressured a U.S. official at the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the purpose of protecting a business monopoly granted to Hanna by Egypt and used in part to fund the bribes being paid to Menendez through his wife. The Department of Justice believes Menendez wielded his influence on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to steer U.S. policy for Egypt. As a ranking member and then the chairman, and therefore possessed influence over the executive branch's decisions to provide foreign military sales, foreign military financing, and other aid or support or to benefit the government of Egypt. And that's from the indictment. So Cairo is one of the largest recipients of U.S. military aid at over $1 billion annually. Egypt is also notorious for human rights abuses. According to the State Department 2022 Human Rights Report on Cairo, it found substantial abuses by the government. Human rights abuses included, and this is all a quote from the report, unlawful or arbitrary killings, including extrajudicial killings by the government or its agents, enforced disappearances by state security, torture, and cases of cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment by the government, harsh and life-threatening prison conditions, arbitrary arrest and detention, political prisoners or detainees, transnational repression against individuals in another country, arbitrary or unlawfully interfering with privacy, serious abuses in conflict, including reportedly enforced disappearances, abduction, physical abuses, and unlawful or widespread civilian deaths or harm. And that is, I want to clarify, a short portion. It could have been a 10,000 word article where I just read about all the horrific things the Egyptian government, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has done. Sisi took power in Egypt in a 2014 military coup. Since taking over as president, Egypt does hold elections, but that's a very loose word since Sisi imprisons and suppressed all of his political rivals to cement his hold on power. And the former president of Egypt, the only Egyptian president that was ever democratically elected, died in Sisi's prison. So while Joe Biden states that his foreign policy is centered on respect for human rights and upholding democracy, Washington has continued to fund and arm the Egyptian military under the current administration. Last week, the White House announced it would slightly curb aid to Egypt. Washington still plans to take $85 million in foreign military aid for Cairo and redirect it towards Taipei. Still, Egypt is set to receive over $1.2 billion in American taxpayer dollars for weapons next year. Last year, the Washington approved arms sales totaling $2.5 billion to Cairo. Under the deals, Egypt can acquire transport aircraft, small arms, and Chinook helicopters. And so part of what Menendez was doing was actually trying to influence these two things. And so the aid to Egypt could have been curbed further if it wasn't for Menendez, and these weapon sales may not have gone through. Now, it's not exactly clear as to if Menendez alone was the reason that these things went through, or if there's a lot of people in government who want to do it anyways, but certainly his power and position and the incentives he had through the bribes he was receiving probably did help to steer American foreign policy, as the Department of Justice says in this indictment. So further reading through this indictment here, as a matter of long-standing voluntary practice, the State Department would typically not proceed with the transfer of foreign military financing grant to Egypt's bank account or with a foreign military sale to Egypt while the chairman or ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had not signed off on and was maintaining a hold on it, such as a transfer or sale. So the indictment is saying that as American government practice, this is how it works, that if Menendez has said no to selling weapons or to providing this aid to Egypt, the State Department wouldn't have signed off on it. So as a result, at times relevant to the indictment, Menendez, as the chairman of the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, possessed substantial influence over foreign military sales and foreign military financing to Egypt. The senator again met with Hanna on or about May 6, 2018, and later that same day, Menendez sought from the State Department non-public information regarding the number and nationality of persons serving at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. Although this information was not classified, it was deemed to be highly sensitive because it could pose significant operational security concerns if disclosed to a foreign government or made public. Without telling his professional staff at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the State Department that he was doing so, on May 7th, Menendez tested that sensitive non-public embassy information to his then girlfriend Nadine, and she forwarded that message to Hanna, who forwarded to an Egyptian government official. And so, you know, we do have situations where, and again, this is probably a little bit different, but we'll talk about Julian Assange next here. And, a part of what they really attack him for is that some of the information that wasn't released by Assange, but was released by other reporters, some of the information that Assange had. And by the way, Assange wanted to clean this up and take the names that didn't need to be on the list off the list. But, this is a part of what they're really going after Assange for in here. Menendez is doing it illegally, where, Assange didn't do it. It was, I think, Luke Harding with The Guardian who was actually responsible for releasing the list of the names the State Department in Afghanistan had. Again, Assange was trying to clean that up before he put out the documents. But it's just interesting that there's no, questions being raised right now if, Menendez got anybody killed or anybody harmed or anything like that. So in 2019, Hanna would request that Menendez help maintain his monopoly over Washington's objections. The senator aided Hanna improperly by advising him to pressure a high-level Department of Agriculture official to stop interfering with Hanna's company. Uribe and Diabas are accused of paying Menendez to interfere in prosecutions against them. While Menendez said the allegations in the indictment are baseless, some groups and politicians are calling for the senator to step down. And I didn't go quite into, I tried to keep this more on what I thought was interesting to the antiwar.com foreign policy audience. But if you want to and go, look into and read, particularly what happened with Diabas is really nefarious. I mean, Menendez was really trying to interfere with what the Justice Department was doing in sentencing him, trying to get the personnel changed, switch prosecutors and things like that. It really abuses of government is what Menendez was doing here. So, on Friday, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced Menendez would step down as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And, it's interesting. He said Bob Menendez has been a dedicated public servant and has always fighting hard for the people of New Jersey. He has a right to due process and a fair trial. Although you would think that, Schumer might be a little bit more concerned about the alleged corruption that was going on, apparently right under his nose in the Senate. All right, so let's talk about Julian Assange here. This is, I guess, a little bit of good news. Australian members of parliament call for Assange's freedom during talks in Washington. A delegation of Australian members of parliament met with U.S. officials in Washington on Wednesday and called for the release of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and he's also an Australian citizen, and faces up to 175 years in prison if extradited to the United States and convicted for exposing U.S. war crimes. The delegation includes 6 MPs from different ends of the political spectrum in a show of unity aimed at freeing Assange. More than 60 Australian MPs also signed on to a letter in support of the trip that called for the U.S. to drop charges against the WikiLeaks founder. After meeting with the Biden administration officials at the Department of Justice in Washington, the Australian delegation held a press conference and said they would keep up the pressure on the U.S. Barnaby Joyce, the leader of the Australian National Party and former deputy prime minister, said Assange was only guilty of being a journalist. Literally, all sides of politics had come together and united on this key message, which is that an Australian citizen, Julian Assange, should come home, Joyce said. Adding, the only crime we see Julian Assange has ever been charged with is the crime of being a journalist, the crime of telling the truth, and the fact that it is an Australian citizen that has been targeted by one of our closest friends and allies is a very real concern to us as politicians and to a growing part of the Australian public. Assange is being pursued by the U.S. for publishing documents obtained by a source, Chelsea Manning, a standard journalistic practice. If Assange is convicted, it would give him grave implications for press freedom in the U.S. and around the world. If you look at what has actually transpired here, the person who is responsible, we understand, for the leak had their sentence commuted, and that's Chelsea Manning. Alex Antic, a Liberal Party senator, told Fox. We are dealing with a situation where the publisher is now being pursued under those circumstances. We have been saying we find it puzzling. I can't see how there wouldn't be a chilling effect on the free press if this was allowed to proceed. And I just want to say good on a few members of Congress. I saw, I believe, Massey, Gates, Marjorie Taylor Greene all met with this delegation. So hopefully we could get Assange freed at some point here. We're still waiting on the extradition, and of course, if we have any major updates in that case, I'll have our good friend Misty Winston back on the show to discuss. All right, so a couple stories here on Haiti. They're a little bit similar, but I think both are important to go through. U.S. to finance train Kenyan soldiers for mission to Haiti. The U.S. is preparing a UN Security Council resolution to authorize Kenya to send its troops into Haiti. Washington believes Nairobi can aid Port-au-Prince in restoring order to gang-controlled territory. The Joe Biden administration said the American taxpayers will foot the bill for the deployment, and U.S. soldiers will train the Kenyan force. For a year, the White House has sought a third country to send its soldiers into Haiti as UN peacekeepers. After Canada resisted U.S. pressure to lead the force, Nairobi agreed to send its troops into the Caribbean nation. The AP notes that some Haitians are opposed to the deployment of UN soldiers from Kenya. In 2011, UN forces released sewage, causing a cholera outbreak that killed nearly 10,000 Haitians. Additionally, Kenyan soldiers have been credibly accused of war crimes in Somalia, where Nairobi conducted military operations in the name of counterterrorism. The Kenyan-based independent medico-legal unit issued a report this month warning Kenyan police are committing an increasing number of human rights abuses since President William Ruto took office. The U.S. has provided significant amount of training to Kenyan soldiers. However, there is no indication that has curbed the Kenyan security forces abuses at home or in Somalia. Speaking at the UN General Assembly in New York on Tuesday, Biden called on the UNSC to pass a resolution allowing Kenya to send its troops into Haiti. On Haiti, the Caribbean country the Caribbean community facilitated a dialogue among Haitian society. I thank President Ruto of Kenya. I thank him for his willingness to serve as the lead nation of the UN Bad Security Support Mission. I call upon the Security Council to authorize this mission. The people of Haiti cannot wait much longer. On Wednesday, Ruto met with the Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry in an official ceremony to commemorate Washington's plot to send the Kenyan forces to Haiti. Washington says it will fund the mission and provide the peacekeepers with training. The security situation in Haiti has devolved since Henry took office in Port-au-Prince. Henry took power over the Caribbean nation after the former leader, Jovenel Moïse, was assassinated in July of 2021. The U.S. backed Henry's ascension to power. He has since been named as a plotter in Moïse's assassination. The Haitian prime minister has backed foreign intervention in his nation despite UN peacekeepers' track record of human rights abuses. UN soldiers are infamous for having sex with underage girls and leaving the women without financial support. All right, so my second article on Haiti provides a little bit more detail. White House pledges $100 million to proposed UN mission to Haiti. So, Secretary of State Antony Blinken explained how the U.S. plans to support a proposed UN deployment to Haiti aimed at restoring order in the country. The White House intends to spend $100 million to support the Kenyan soldiers sent to the Caribbean nation. Washington believes the troops can be deployed to Haiti within a few months. On Friday, Blinken hosted a meeting in New York of countries that support Washington's effort to get the UN Security Council to approve a resolution that would see Kenya lead an international force in Haiti. Blinken said at that meeting, as the Haitian National Police work to get full strength and capability security assistance from international partners, can play a critical role in bridging that gap. That's why the United States supports the UN-backed multinational security force mission. Blinken went on to pledge $165 million in military assistance to Kenya and Haiti. The U.S. also announcing an additional $65 million to further professionalize the Haitian National Police and strengthen its capacity to dismantle the gangs and safeguard communities. The White House intends to work with our Congress to provide $100 million in support for our Department of Defense is prepared to provide robust enabling support, including planning assistance, intelligence support, airlift communications, and medical supports. And so I believe is $100 million that's going to just go to fund the Kenyan mission. Blinken noted that the White House has previously provided Haiti with over $120 million in security assistance. The Joe Biden administration has wanted to deploy an international force to Haiti for over a year. In 2021, more Haitians began to arrive at the U.S. border seeking entry. As candidate, Biden repeatedly denounced then President Donald Trump's immigration policy as inhumane. The situation proved a political nightmare for the White House. U.S. Border Patrol agents were photographed using questionable tactics. These were the photographs that you had the Border Patrol agents on horseback, and depending, I guess, on who you ask, they either just were using long reins for their horses because that's the kind of reins they used, or they were using those reins to whip the Haitian migrants and kind of round them up. Either way, the tactics, using horseback to round up migrants seems like a pretty bad idea. Maybe there's a better reason for it, but anyways, there's obviously better ways to do it than that were done. And so anyways, but initially it was just reported, and I think a lot of people still believe that those Border Patrol agents were just whipping the migrants. And so that, plus the fact that the White House has deported tens of thousands of Haitians back to their home country, has been a real problem for the Joe Biden administration. I think this is probably going to only become a bigger problem as we get closer to the election. Last time the Democrats really ran on this idea that immigrants need to be people who show up at the southern border need to be treated humanely and, should be welcomed into this country and all that stuff. And that really has not happened in any way under President Joe Biden. And I know the right has made a big deal about how many migrants are coming into the country, but the Biden administration has used a lot of the Trump administration's policies as well. And, the situation is, I think, worse under Biden because a lot of the things that the Trump administration did, like judicially to arrest, detain migrants, break up families, and things like that, are just what the U.S. does as a part of their border enforcement policies. If you have people showing up at the border and it's not clear that they're parent and child, that it's not always that the government is going to keep those people together. And so I think one of the maybe beneficial things about Trump's immigration policy, and I say that very tentatively, was that he was so brash, it probably deterred people from even arriving at the southern border out of fear of how they would be treated. Where versus the Biden administration's immigration policy has been much more muted, and, you know, they at least claim to be pro-immigrant, but they're really not. And so you have far more people showing up at the southern border and being subject to mistreated in the American justice system because, you know, you're not being honest about how you're going to treat people when they arrive. Where I guess that's the kind of one positive thing you could say about the Trump administration. He was very forward about it, and you know, Biden has disguised it for domestic political reasons. Kind of is the way I look at it. So back to the article here. Since Henry became prime minister, Gaines have taken control over more of Haitian territory. The Haitian leader has responded by supporting Washington's effort to deploy UN peacekeepers to his country. He said, "Democracy is at peril. Our country needs to return to normalcy. Improved security must be accompanied by real progress to resolve the political crisis. The support mission will not be a substitute for political progress." Of course, it's kind of ridiculous for Henry to talk about, you know, democracy as his claim to power in Haiti basically rest in Washington. When Morsi was assassinated, he wasn't even in the government at the time. The prime minister was Claude Joseph, who received a significant amount of pressure from the West after Morsi was assassinated, and he stepped down and allowed Ariel Henry to take his seat. So there are significant potential issues if UN soldiers are deployed to Haiti. And then I just mentioned the things I mentioned in the last article about the cholera outbreak and the human rights abuses routinely committed by Haitian security forces. All right. Next up here, we have some news on the budget and the war in Ukraine. Pentagon exempts Ukraine operations from potential government shutdown. The Pentagon exempt its operations supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia from a government shutdown that will happen if Congress fails to pass a funding bill before September 30th. During government shutdowns, the U.S. military typically suspends activities that are not deemed vital to U.S. national security, but Pentagon spokesperson Chris Sherwood told Politico on Thursday that the U.S. support for Ukraine will not be suspended. U.S. support for Ukraine includes training of Ukrainian soldiers in the U.S. and Europe, arms shipments, and providing targeting intelligence. Just 2 days earlier, Sherwood told Politico that the U.S. support for Ukraine might be hindered by a shutdown. The Politico report on the Pentagon's decision to exempt the Ukraine operations come after Zelensky met with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in Washington. The Pentagon said Austin met with Zelensky to reaffirm the steadfast U.S. support for Ukraine. The exemption demonstrates the importance the Biden administration has placed on fueling the proxy war in Ukraine. While being done in the name of national security, the policy makes the U.S. much less safe by risking direct war with Russia, which possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal. So, a little bit more on the funding stuff here. We have 28 Republicans tell Biden they're against more Ukraine aid amid Zelensky's visit. A group of 28 Republicans in the House and Senate recently released a letter to the White House saying that they're opposed to authorizing more spending on the war in Ukraine as Zelensky visited Washington. The Republicans said there were too many unanswered questions related to what the U.S. goals were in Ukraine and how long the conflict would last. For these reasons, and certainly until we receive answers to these questions above and others forthcoming, we oppose the additional expenditure for the war in Ukraine included in your request. President Biden has asked for an additional $24 billion for Ukraine, which would bring total U.S. spending on the proxy war to about $137 billion. The White House and Democrats in Congress even want to include money in the funding bill that needs to be passed before September 30th to avert a government shutdown. But that prospect seems unlikely as the Republican-controlled House is battling over spending levels and has failed to move forward with a Pentagon funding bill. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy also did not include the $24 billion in new Ukraine aid in the House stopgap funding bill that would avert a shutdown, which is not expected to pass as is. The aid is expected to ultimately get approved, but not as quickly as the White House would like, even as some Republicans in the House who support spending more on the war in Ukraine say it's not a priority, since the Pentagon still has billions to use to ship weapons that were made available by a Pentagon, what they called an accounting error, that overestimated the value of arms shipments. They said this freed up an additional $6 billion. How convenient. The situation in Washington is much different than when Zelensky last visited in December 22, when he was given a hero's welcome and spoke before Congress. McCarthy said he declined to request for the Ukrainian leader to address a joint session of Congress this time around because we just don't have time. Instead of a dramatic speech, Zelensky held a closed-door meeting with dozens of senators and separate talks with some members of the House. Politico reported that Ukraine aid skeptics were not swayed by the Ukrainian leader's visit. So next up, we have a little bit more detail here. This is an article that I wrote for antiwar.com over the weekend. House Speaker reverses course, will add Ukraine funding to defense bill. All right, so we have that $24 million aid, and that's different than what I'm talking about here. This is a $300 million aid package. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy announced on Saturday that the House would vote on a Pentagon funding bill that includes aid for Ukraine. Initially, the congressman said that the $300 million in aid for Kiev would be voted on separately from the annual Department of Defense spending bill. Congress is seeking to pass spending bills before funding for the government runs out at the end of the month. Politicians are warning that if legislation is not passed by Washington, we'll enter a government shutdown. Despite the connotation, most American government will continue to function even if Congress does not provide funding. Last week, the White House announced that military aid to Ukraine will persist whether there is a shutdown or not. Both houses of Congress recently passed significantly different versions of the National Defense Authorization Act. As that bill is likely to face significant debate, it is unlikely to pass prior to the end of the month when the current funding runs out. And so, just as a quick breakdown here, if you're going to fund the Pentagon, there's kind of three ways to do it. There's the National Defense Authorization Act, and this is a bill that not only impacts funding levels, but also policy changes. And so currently there's a big debate in Congress surrounding the NDAA and the Pentagon providing money to female soldiers to travel outside of states that have strict abortion regulations to go to states where they could have an abortion. Now, the Pentagon budget is $800 and something billion. The Pentagon cannot pass an audit. So my guess is that there has to be a few hundred of these cases a year where you have a female soldier that gets pregnant, wants to get an abortion, and happens to be in a state that doesn't allow abortions. For not that there's any states that have outright banned abortions, but for whatever reason, she, wouldn't be able to get an abortion in that state because she's several months pregnant or whatever like that. Now, my guess is that the Pentagon has enough money that they could do some bureaucratic thing where they send her on a, training exercise to a different state that just so happens to have more liberal abortion laws, and she could, while there, get her abortion and then not do the training and take a medical rest or something like that, right? Doesn't seem like that would really be an issue that an organization the size of the Pentagon has. And then, of course, from the Republican perspective, too, if they really cared about children, they would be, working really hard to end U.S. bombs being dropped, in the Middle East or sent to Ukraine, and saving children that way, rather than, again, this very probably limited number of people who would be prevented from getting an abortion should the Pentagon force those women to remain in the states that they're in, not allow them to travel or not provide them money to travel to a different state. And so this seems like a really ridiculous political debate to have that really doesn't have anything to do with the Pentagon funding bill, but it's going to hold up the Pentagon funding bill. And so another option to fund the Pentagon would be to just use a appropriations bill. And so this is what House Speaker Kevin McCarthy has proposed. He wants to pass bills, separate bills, which this is the way, I really do believe it should be done. If, you're going to have a government and you're going to have a massive multi-trillion-dollar government, at the very least, the Department of Defense should have its own spending bill that's debated. The Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, and USDA should all have these separate bills that should be debated. And so, unlike an NDAA, appropriations legislation is only going to impact funding levels. And so, if they say they have a new ship thing they want to build, they'll throw that in the appropriations bill. It'll alter the funding level, but it's not going to change policy. And then this is different from a continuing resolution, which is what the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer wants to do. And this is just to continue to fund the government at the same policies and the same levels. And so those are kind of the different things. And McCarthy has also proposed, by the way, to do a short-term CR, like I think 45 days, and basically to give the government a little more time to debate this and get it done. Now, this is one of my least favorite things to really talk about on the show, the budgetary stuff, because it is all political theater. Every single year, Congress takes like 6 weeks off at the end of summer, like through August, they're all on vacation, right? And then they get back in September and they say, oh my God, we have a $4 trillion organization to fund. And so everybody completely freaks out and there's a threat of a government shutdown. They'll pass a couple continuing resolution bills. And so during the holidays, when all Americans just want to be happy and spend time with their families, there's always this huge debate over, is the government going to get shut down? And then there's news stories about how, these poor federal government employees might not have money for their to buy Christmas presents for the children on the holidays because, government funding means not that any of the senators or anything are going to suffer, but whoever gives tours at the White House and stuff, they're going to be laid off for a couple weeks. And so, it's all political theater. It's set up to be this huge crisis every year, to get all Americans fired up and angry at each other. And really, they're just talking about mostly shoving different kinds of pork into these bills and stuff, and who's going to make the most off of the corruption and all that kind of crap. So, initially on Friday, McCarthy said that he was going to split it and he was going to take the $300 million in assistance out of the Ukraine appropriations bill and separate that and have a vote. But then I guess he decided that he wouldn't pick up Democratic support that way. And so the way to pick up Democratic support would be to include the $300 million. And this is going to hurt him with some Republican support, but I guess he figures it will pass that way. So that's the situation with the funding bill. I hope I was clear enough and that it wasn't too confusing. I know that there's a lot going on there, and it's just a huge mess, and I really hate the funding stuff because, again, it's just I think almost all political theater in Washington. All right, Biden gives Ukraine more cluster bombs during Zelensky's visit. This from Dave DeCamp last week. President Biden met with Ukrainian President Zelensky on Thursday and announced a new tranche of military aid for Ukraine that includes more cluster bombs, which are notorious for killing and maiming civilians. The orange package is worth $325 million and uses a presidential drawdown authority, which allows Biden to ship arms directly from U.S. military stockpiles. The $325 million is being pulled from funds that became available after the Pentagon said it overvalued previous arms shipments to Ukraine and found an accounting error that freed up an additional $6.2 billion in PDA funds to fuel the war. And so just really quickly running through this package, they have AIM-9M missiles for air defenses, additional ammunition for HIMARS, Avenger air defense systems, 50 caliber machine guns, to counter unmanned aerial systems. So I guess they're going to use them as air defenses. 155 millimeter artillery rounds, including cluster munitions, 105 millimeter artillery rounds, TOW missiles, those are anti-tank missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, $3 million, 3 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 59 light tactical vehicles, demolition munitions for obstacle clearing, spare parts maintenance, and field equipment. The U.S. sent its first shipment of cluster bombs to Ukraine in July. To do so, President Biden had to bypass U.S. law that prohibits the transfer of cluster munitions with a dud rate of higher than 1%, which refers to the percentage of the submunitions that are left unexploded and can be found by civilians for years or decades to come. And I have read that number, according to the New York Times, that's 14%, but could actually be about double that, around 25%. All right, so next up, article here from Connor Freeman, antiwar.com. White House close to providing Kiev with cluster-armed ATACMS. So the White House is close to deciding it will provide Ukraine with cluster-armed versions of the Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, which have a range of nearly 200 miles and can be fired from HIMARS launchers. The HIMARS in Kiev's possession are currently firing munitions with a range of 50 miles. The U.S. arming Ukrainian forces with ATACMS will mark a significant escalation in the proxy war against Russia. Sending ATACMS was ruled out until recently over concerns the weapons could be used by Kiev for attacks inside of Crimea and the Russian mainland. However, for months, Kiev has launched more attacks against Russian territory, and previous U.S. concerns of escalation waned. There have been reports saying that the White House was increasingly considering sending ATACMS to Ukraine. Earlier this month, during an appearance on ABC's This Week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was asked if he approved of Ukraine using U.S.-provided ATACMS to carry out strikes deep inside Russian territory. Blinken said, in terms of targeting decisions, it's their decision, not ours. As the Post has previously reported in the Discord leaks, that behind closed doors, President Zelensky has proposed going in a more audacious direction, privately planning for a long-range missile to hit targets inside of Russian borders, according to classified U.S. intelligence documents detailing his internal communications with top aides and military leaders. Kiev is currently carrying out drone strikes in Crimea and Russia, which rely on U.S. targeting assistance. The plan to provide ATACMS was postponed ultimately because there were not enough kept in U.S. stocks, according to officials, said that arming Kiev with long-range missiles would have a negative impact on the Pentagon's readiness for other wars and conflicts. Although sources speaking with the Post explain that now the White House has instead planned to send a version of ATACMS armed with cluster munitions or bomblets as opposed to the single or unitary warhead. The cluster-armed version of the ATACMS is still not considered a frontline U.S. weapon anymore and is much more plentiful in supply. Kiev is requesting hundreds of these missiles, and so I think this probably has to do with the U.S. needs to make sure that Ukraine doesn't decide that the best route for them is negotiations. And so one of the ways to do that is to keep shoveling weapons at Zelensky. And, this seems like this is probably going to work a little bit. Another article here by Connor Freeman. Kiev launches more strikes on Sevastopol in Crimea. Kiev launched cruise missiles attacks on the Crimean peninsulas with weapons provided by NATO on Friday. This was followed by another missile strike on Sevastopol, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet is based, on Saturday morning. Ukraine's intelligence chief told Voice of America, that's a U.S. state-funded media outlet, that at least 9 people were killed and 16 others were wounded during the attack on Friday. The Russian Defense Ministry said there was no casualties, but the strike have left one service member missing. A Ukrainian military source speaking with BBC said the attack was carried out using UK provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles, which have a range of roughly 155 miles. The missiles can be launched from Kiev's Soviet-era MiG-29 warplanes. According to a statement from the Ukrainian military on Friday, the missile strike was specifically timed to target a meeting of Russian naval officials. The statement claimed that the Air Force conducted 12 strikes on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, which resulted in dozens of dead and wounded occupants, including the top management of the fleet. Moscow annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 following a U.S.-backed coup in Kiev. Polling conducted since then has indicated an overwhelming support among Crimeans for rejoining the Russian Federation. Even Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who supports Kiev's strikes on Russia, has previously acknowledged that Crimea is a red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Sevastopol's governor wrote on Telegram that the city had come under attack again on Saturday morning, citing debris from missiles that have fallen near a pier after being downed by air defenses. The governor also noted that the missile fragments have fallen into the northern Sevastopol Park. Ukrainian President Zelensky maintains that peace talks cannot happen unless all Ukrainian territory lost to Russia has been recaptured, including the Black Sea Peninsula. Echoing statements made earlier this month in the wake of Friday's attack, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov declared the Western powers are de facto fighting us using the hands and bodies of Ukrainians. He described the West as a real empire of lies and capable of negotiating with the rest of the world. Earlier in the war, efforts by Tel Aviv, Ankara, and the UN to broker peace settlements, which could have ended the war on terms acceptable to Kiev and Moscow, were deliberately sabotaged by Washington and London. Earlier this year, ahead of Kiev's counteroffensive, which the White House and Western policy officials knew would fail, Blinken denounced Beijing's attempt to mediate negotiations between the two sides and achieve a ceasefire. He said actually that, a ceasefire wouldn't help at all. All right, new ad here by Bill Kristol. This from Dave DeCamp, great article. All right, a new group formed by the GOP to support the war in Ukraine. A new group formed to rally GOP support for the war in Ukraine released an ad this weekend that said the U.S. spending on the war in Ukraine is good because it benefits the U.S. by weakening Russia. The ad was made by Republicans for Ukraine, a campaign launched by Defending Democracy Together, an organization led by neoconservative Bill Kristol. The effort comes as support for Army Ukraine is waning among GOP voters, with a recent CNN poll finding 71% of Republicans were against Congress authorizing more aid to Ukraine. When American arms Ukraine, we get a lot for a little. Putin is an enemy of America. We've used 5% of our defense budget to arm Ukraine, and with it, they've destroyed 50% of Putin's army. The ad is blunt and does not attempt to frame U.S. support for Ukraine as a fight for democracy as the Biden administration does, and claims hurting Russia also hurts China. The more the Ukraine weakens Russia, the more it also weakens Russia's closest ally, China. America needs to stand strong against our enemies. That's why Republicans in Congress must continue to support Ukraine. And while, look, I'm not saying that Bill Kristol is right about anything, this does confirm a lot of what I've been saying on the show since the very start of this war, that it really doesn't, the war isn't about Ukraine. And in a way, it's not even about Russia. It's about China. They're worried that they push Russia and China so close together that now they have to do something to really weaken Russia, so when they fight the war against China, they're more prepared for it. So it's absolutely ridiculous and dangerous and could all get us killed in a nuclear war. But this is the Bill Kristol logic that drives American foreign policy. All right, so last article up here today, I thought was a pretty interesting one. Polish Prime Minister tells Zelensky to never insult Poles again. So the Polish Prime Minister said on Friday that Ukrainian President Zelensky must never insult Polish people again, as Warsaw and Kiev are at odds over Ukrainian grain imports. I wanted to tell Zelensky never to insult Poles again, as he did recently during his speech at the UN. Zelensky targeted Poland and two other EU countries for continuing to ban the import of Ukrainian grain in the UN General Assembly speech, accusing them of aiding Russia. After Zelensky's speech, the prime minister was asked if grain spat would impact Polish support for Ukraine. He replied by saying Poland was no longer arming the country. And so we talked about this last week. Poland isn't ending U.S. arms going through their country into Ukraine, but they are done with actually sending their own arms to Ukraine. And so, I do think this is a pretty significant sign that there may be some pretty serious fractures starting to emerge among the supporters of Ukraine, and particularly Poland, who has been one of the countries that has attempted to push NATO to support Ukraine, maybe more than any other country. Maybe the Baltic states a little bit more, but it's really been Poland and the Baltic states making the biggest push. So now, you have this. You also have this incident where when Zelensky was, making his rounds in North America, he was not only in the U.S., but also in Canada. And in Canada, Zelensky and Trudeau, the Canadian leader, met with an actual World War II Nazi in support of Ukraine. And so I think these kind of things are really going to start to fracture support for Ukraine. And, we'll see how this all plays out. But, by the next show, we could be talking about how the U.S. bullied Warsaw or bribed Warsaw into returning to arm Ukraine. They say, hey, we'll give you a whole bunch of weapons if you send some of your old weapons to Ukraine. And so that could certainly push Warsaw into making that decision. They could try to, there's a lot of pending arms sales to Warsaw that maybe the U.S. could threaten to pull if they don't continue sending arms to Ukraine. However, if Ukraine, there's a lot of issues here. Again, there is a significant portion of the Ukrainian government that has real ethno-nationalist views, and those views have led them to passing laws that, really condemn and hurt the lives of Ukraine's minority populations. And while this is mainly directed at the ethnic Russians that make up a large percentage of the Ukrainian population, like 20-30% maybe, there's also hundreds of thousands of Poles and Hungarians in Ukraine that are also affected by these laws. And, Poland and Hungary take issue with that. So, again, the support for Ukraine could continue to fracture over this grain stuff, over the Nazi stuff, over the ethnic laws, and we'll see how it plays out. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more later in the week.